The bear cub was desperately struggling in the water when an old man suddenly emerged from behind the trees and, without hesitation, pulled him to the shore. But when the cub came to his senses, he saw something that made him freeze in fear. What was it? Leave your guesses in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out what happens next. The forest had always been a safe haven for the young bear cub. Tall trees stretched high above, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind, and the ground was soft with moss that cushioned each step. But today, something was different. The cub, driven by a curiosity he couldn't fully understand, had wandered too far. The scent of fresh water had led him toward a lake he had never noticed before, its surface shimmering under the soft glow of the sun. With each step closer to the water's edge, the cub's excitement grew. He had heard the sounds of the water rushing, and the sight of it seemed magical, endless, and inviting. His tiny paws patted along the pebbled shore, and for a moment, the world felt still, serene. He dipped his paw into the cool water, intrigued by the sensation. But in an instant, the ground beneath him shifted, and the cub lost his footing. The current, much stronger than he had anticipated, pulled him in with surprising force. Panic surged through his chest as his small body was dragged deeper into the lake. His paws flailed wildly, trying to find something solid to hold onto, but there was nothing but the relentless pull of the water. His tiny lungs burned as he gasped for air, the water swallowing him with each desperate attempt to stay afloat. The young bear fought with every ounce of strength, but the current was too powerful. The water seemed to twist around him, pulling him further into the depths, his vision blurring as his energy drained away. His little heart hammered in his chest, and for the first time in his young life, he felt the crushing weight of helplessness. The shore, once so close, now felt like a distant memory. With each passing second, the cub's strength waned. His limbs became heavy, his movements sluggish. He tried to cry out, but the sound was lost in the rush of the water. Fear began to cloud his mind, a dark realization creeping in that perhaps this was the end. This vast, cold lake was too much for him to overcome. The world around him was spinning, and the cub's thoughts began to blur, his tiny body surrendering to the pull of the water. Just when the darkness began to take over, a glimmer of hope flickered in his fading consciousness. The sound of rushing water filled the cub's ears, drowning out everything else as his world narrowed to a blur of ripples and rushing currents. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He could no longer fight, no longer resist. His small body, once full of life and energy, now felt like a fragile leaf carried away by the wind. The cold water seeped into his bones, chilling him to the core, and his vision began to fade, the world around him slipping away. Just as the last of his strength seemed to vanish, something extraordinary happened. A faint rustling reached his ears, barely audible over the relentless roar of the water. At first, he thought it was just another trick of his fading senses, but then it grew louder, unmistakable, a figure moving swiftly through the brush, heading straight for the water's edge. From behind a cluster of thick trees, an old man appeared, his withered face framed by a tangle of graying hair and a thick beard. His eyes, sharp and clear, locked onto the cub with an intensity that seemed to defy his age. Dressed in worn, earth-toned clothes that had clearly seen many seasons, the man moved with surprising speed, his footsteps sure and steady on the uneven ground. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, as though he had seen this moment coming long before the cub had even stepped into the lake. Without a second thought, the old man surged forward, stepping into the cold, rushing water. His boots sank into the pebbled lake bed, the water rushing around his legs as he waded deeper into the lake. His face was grim, but his hands, calloused and strong from years of working the land, moved with surprising tenderness as he reached for the cub. The old man's breath came in quick, steady bursts, his heart racing not from fear, but from the urgency of the situation. He had lived a long, solitary life in the forest, but he had never hesitated when it came to saving a creature in need. He knew what it meant to be vulnerable in the wild, to be at the mercy of nature's power, and he wasn't about to let this small, helpless cub drown. The water swirled around his waist as he fought against the current, each step an effort. The cub, barely clinging to life, was just out of reach, his small body being swept further from the shore with every passing second. But the man's grip was steady, his hands closing around the cub with a strength that seemed at odds with his years. With a firm but gentle motion, he pulled the bear cub to his chest, cradling it with surprising care despite the urgency of the moment. For a fleeting moment, the cub's eyes flickered open, barely registering the man's face. A warm, rough hand brushed the water from his fur, and he felt himself being lifted, pulled out of the suffocating grip of the lake. His head lolled against the man's chest, the rhythmic pulse of his rescuer's heart offering a strange comfort in this moment of chaos. The old man's breath was labored, his muscles aching as he trudged through the water, but he never faltered. Finally, with one last determined step, he reached the shore, his boots scraping against the rocks as he emerged from the lake's grasp. He collapsed to the ground, the weight of the cub still cradled in his arms. His heart pounded in his chest, but relief swept over him as he realized the cub was alive. Barely breathing, but alive. The old man looked down at the small creature, his face softening as he gently laid the cub on the damp earth, his hand hovering protectively over the tiny body. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant lapping of the lake's edge. The old man exhaled slowly, wiping the wet strands of hair from his forehead, as the cub's tiny chest rose and fell, its breath growing steadier with each passing moment. The storm had passed for now, but the old man knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. The old man sat back, his back pressed against the damp earth, his breath still heavy from the struggle. His arms ached with the weight of the cub, but he didn't mind. The adrenaline that had coursed through his veins now settled into a quiet relief. The lake behind him seemed to fall silent, as though it, too, had paused in respect for the small, fragile life he had just saved. For a few moments, the cub lay still on the ground, his small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The old man's gaze lingered on the little creature, his weathered face softened with a tenderness that few ever saw. His eyes were a mixture of concern and something deeper, gratitude, perhaps, for this unexpected connection between them. The cub was a living thing, a reminder of the beauty and fragility of the world around him. He had saved it, yes, but there was no denying that, in some quiet way, the cub had also saved him. A small whimper escaped the cub's throat, breaking the stillness. The old man leaned forward slightly, his calloused hands brushing away the droplets of water still clinging to the cub's fur. His fingers trembled ever so slightly as he gently propped the cub's head up, feeling the warmth of the small creature against his palm. The cub's eyes fluttered open slowly, the world spinning around him as he struggled to focus. His vision was blurry, and everything seemed larger than it should be. The scent of wet earth and grass filled his nose, mingling with the strong, musty smell of the lake. The cub blinked, his tiny body trembling as he tried to make sense of the strange, unfamiliar surroundings. Where was he? What had happened? His mind swirled with confusion, his thoughts tangled like a knot he couldn't unravel. His fur was cold and heavy, and his limbs felt weak, as though he had been drained of all his energy. He tried to move, but his body resisted, and his chest heaved as he gasped for breath. The memories of the water, the terror of sinking deeper and deeper, seemed distant now, as though they belonged to someone else. The old man watched the cub struggle, his heart aching at the sight. He had seen animals in pain before, but this was different. There was something about this little bear, something fragile and yet fierce, something that mirrored the old man's own life in ways he couldn't explain. Slowly, he reached out and placed a hand on the cub's back, steadying him as his body quivered. The cub's wide, dark eyes finally found the old man's face. The gaze was blank at first, uncomprehending, and then, as the cub's senses slowly returned, something shifted. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes, followed by a faint, hesitant sound, a low grunt of confusion or perhaps thanks. The old man couldn't tell, but he smiled gently, his weathered lips curling at the edges. "There you are, little one," he murmured under his breath, his voice a gravelly whisper. The words, simple as they were, seemed to offer some comfort to the cub. It was strange, really. The old man had always lived alone, his life marked by silence and solitude, but here, in this moment, he felt a sense of connection that he hadn't known he needed. The cub's head shifted, his eyes darting around, still uncertain, but his breathing was more even now. He had survived, and that realization seemed to fill him with both fear and a strange sense of wonder. He had been saved. But by whom? The old man was unlike anyone he had ever seen, his long beard and weather-beaten face seemed foreign to the cub, yet there was a warmth in his presence that soothed the young bear's panicked mind. For a long while, neither of them moved. The wind whispered through the trees above them, the forest alive with the sounds of its hidden creatures. Time seemed to stretch and slow, as though the universe itself were holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The old man remained by the cub's side, his hand still resting lightly on the bear's back, ensuring he was safe, comforting him without words. And slowly, as the moments passed, the cub began to stir, his limbs no longer as heavy, his heart beating steadily in his chest. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he was alive, and in that brief moment, it was enough. The cub's senses slowly sharpened as he lay on the ground, still feeling the warmth of the old man's hand resting on his back. The forest around them was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. The sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong had faded into an eerie stillness. The cub's small body was no longer shaking as it had been moments ago, but his mind remained tangled with confusion and wariness. He blinked, lifting his head slightly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The trees loomed overhead, their trunks tall and imposing, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and moss. His tiny body ached, but it was the stillness that unsettled him the most. There was something wrong, something that felt different now. He couldn't quite put his paw on it, but a sense of danger hung in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. As he shifted slightly, trying to get a better view of the world around him, the movement caught his attention. A figure emerged from the tree line, large and imposing, her silhouette framed by the fading light of the day. The cub's heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto her form. She was unmistakable. A she-bear, her massive frame towering above the underbrush. Her thick coat was a deep, dark brown, her muscles rippling beneath the fur as she moved with a grace that belied her size. Her presence was overwhelming, filling the air with an undeniable force. The cub froze, his small body tensing as his gaze fixed on her. She was coming closer, her eyes trained directly on the old man, and it was in that moment that the cub understood the danger was far from over. The she-bear's eyes glinted in the fading light, sharp and calculating. Her gaze was fixed firmly on the old man, her expression unreadable at first, but slowly, the tension in her features became clear. Her nostrils flared as she sniffed the air, her instincts warning her of the presence of a stranger. The cub's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the bear approach, her every step purposeful and deliberate. The old man, still sitting beside the cub, had not yet noticed the she-bear's approach. He was focused on the bear cub, his fingers gently brushing the damp fur, his mind lost in the relief of the rescue. But the cub's eyes never left the approaching figure. He could sense the hostility radiating from her, the way her massive frame seemed to fill the space with an unspoken challenge. The she-bear's movements were slow, measured, but there was no mistaking the intent behind them. She was not coming closer out of curiosity or concern. The old man's hands, once steady, began to tremble as a primal instinct surged within him. He could feel the change in the air, the shift in the forest's energy. Something was coming, and it wasn't good. Slowly, his head turned, following the cub's gaze, and his heart sank as he saw the she-bear advancing toward them. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken words. The she-bear's gaze was filled with an undeniable hostility, her body language stiff and threatening. Her lips curled slightly, revealing the faintest hint of her teeth, a silent warning. The cub's instincts screamed at him, urging him to move, to run, but his body was frozen in place, too exhausted to flee. The old man's breath caught in his throat. He had seen many creatures in his life, but this was different. The she-bear wasn't just protecting her cub, there was something deeper in her gaze, something that spoke of years of survival in the wilderness. She saw him as a threat, an intruder, and no amount of reasoning or goodwill would change that. The cub could feel the tension building, the air thick with danger. He wanted to call out to the old man, to warn him, but his voice was lost in the thundering beat of his own heart. His eyes flickered between the old man and the she-bear, and it was clear this moment would determine everything. The she-bear took another step forward, her massive paws sinking into the earth with quiet strength. Her gaze remained unwavering, a hostility clear in every movement. The cub felt a sudden, unexpected surge of emotion, a deep, primal instinct to protect the one who had saved him. Despite the fear coursing through him, he knew what he had to do. But what would the old man do? Would he fight? Or would he turn and leave, hoping to survive the encounter? The forest held its breath, the tension between the two creatures growing thicker by the second. The cub's heart raced, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was something else, something he couldn't quite understand but felt deeply within his chest. His eyes never left the she-bear, his mother, as she advanced with an air of quiet strength. With each powerful stride she took, the cub's instinct told him to run to her, to seek the safety and comfort that only she could provide. But he hesitated for only a moment. The old man's presence, the warmth of his protection still lingered in the cub's senses. The memory of being pulled from the water, the tenderness with which the man had cradled him, played through his mind like a vivid dream. For a brief, fleeting moment, he had felt the touch of someone who wasn't his mother, but who had given him everything he needed in that crucial moment of his life. And then, without a second thought, the cub pushed himself up, his tiny legs unsteady, but driven by an overwhelming need to return to the one who had brought him into safety. He didn't know what the man was to him. Was he a friend? A stranger? A savior? All the cub knew in that moment was that the man had pulled him from the brink of death and into the warmth of the earth once again. With surprising speed for his small size, the cub dashed toward the she-bear, his paws slipping slightly on the damp earth but pushing him forward. His legs were still weak from the ordeal, but his heart was strong, fueled by an instinctual drive to reach his mother. The cub's little body moved with a purpose, and when he finally reached her, he didn't hesitate. Without looking back, he bounded to her side, burying his small head into the dense fur of her belly, the comforting scent of her earthy coat filling his senses. The she-bear's massive body tensed for a fraction of a second, her sharp eyes fixed on the old man as her cub nuzzled against her. She stood frozen for a brief moment, watching the man with a wary intensity, her muscles coiled and ready for any sudden movement. The forest around them felt suddenly smaller, the air growing thick with the weight of the unseen battle between trust and suspicion. The cub's eyes flickered back to the old man for an instant, his gaze filled with something undefinable, a mix of gratitude, confusion, and a deep, innocent trust that only a creature who had been saved could understand. The old man was still sitting on the ground, unmoving, as if waiting for the next moment to unfold. His weathered face, usually so unreadable, now seemed to soften as he looked at the cub, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. The she-bear's nostrils flared as she took in the situation, her sharp gaze still fixed on the old man. Her body shifted slightly, muscles rippling beneath her thick fur, but she did not advance, not yet. She studied the man with a cautious wariness, her protective instincts flaring. There was no sign of aggression in her posture, yet the silent tension in the air was palpable. She was not about to risk her cub's safety for anything, and the old man could feel that in the very marrow of his bones. The cub, nestled against his mother, looked up at her, his small face calm now, his heartbeat slow and steady. It was as though a silent understanding had passed between them. He was safe. He was with his mother, where he belonged. And yet, his gaze lingered on the old man for a moment longer, as if in some strange way, trying to convey the message his tiny voice could not. The she-bear finally shifted her gaze from the man to the cub, her eyes softening for just a moment. The tension in her body seemed to loosen, just slightly, and she gave a quiet, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the cub's silent words. The old man had saved him. He had brought him back from the brink, and now, in the presence of the she-bear, the bond between them all seemed to settle into something unspoken but deeply understood. Without further hesitation, the she-bear turned her body away from the old man, her massive frame shifting with surprising gentleness as she began to move deeper into the forest. The cub, feeling the safety of his mother's presence, followed at her heels, his small paws making soft imprints in the earth. The old man watched them go, his heart still racing from the encounter, his thoughts a swirl of emotions he couldn't fully grasp. He had saved the cub, but he had also gained something far more valuable, something that could never be fully understood with words. The silence between them all spoke volumes, a language older than the forest itself. And as the she-bear and her cub disappeared into the shadows of the trees, the old man exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The tension in the air slowly faded, leaving only the soft rustling of the leaves behind. For now, it was over. The cub had been saved, and perhaps, in some small way, he had changed the course of their lives forever. The old man stood motionless, his legs trembling beneath him, as the last echoes of the she-bear's retreating footsteps faded into the distance. His breath came in slow, deliberate gasps, the adrenaline from the tense encounter slowly beginning to ebb away. His heart still pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the wild rush of emotions that had surged through him in those final moments with the bear. He felt a lingering sense of awe and unease, as if the forest itself were holding its breath in the aftermath of such a profound exchange. The landscape around him had returned to its natural rhythm. Birds once again flitted among the branches, insects buzzed through the air, and the soft rustling of leaves filled the quiet spaces. But for the old man, the world felt different now. It wasn't just the peace that settled over the forest, but something deeper, a quiet, overwhelming sense of fulfillment. For so many years, he had lived alone, isolated from others, removed from the rhythms of human life and companionship. But today, everything had changed. Today, he had been part of something larger than himself, a moment in the cycle of life that he would carry with him for the rest of his days. The encounter with the she-bear, the cub, the delicate balance of fear and trust, they were all woven into the fabric of the old man's existence now, like threads in a tapestry he hadn't even known was being created. A small smile tugged at the corners of his weathered lips as he slowly straightened his back, his old bones creaking with the effort. He looked down at his hands, still damp from the cold lake water, the roughness of his palms a reminder of years spent laboring in the wilderness. They were the hands of a man who had known hardship and solitude, yet these same hands had pulled the tiny bear from the depths, saving its life in a way he had never thought possible. The joy was not in the act of heroism itself, it wasn't about the man being the one to save the cub. It was in the quiet satisfaction that he had done something right, something that made a difference in the world, however small it may seem. The old man's life had always been about survival, about enduring the harshness of nature and the weight of his own solitude. But today, he had shared in something rare, a connection to another living being, a bond forged in an instant, and a recognition that transcended language, that went beyond the differences between man and animal. His gaze drifted back to the path where the she-bear had disappeared, her massive form now just a memory in the dense underbrush. He wondered if she would remember him, if she would think back to the old man who had saved her cub and nod in silent acknowledgement once more. Perhaps not. Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that the cub was safe, that it had been given a second chance at life. That, more than anything else, filled his heart with warmth. The old man felt a deep, unspoken pride swell within him, a quiet, humble pride that had little to do with accolades or recognition. It was the pride of knowing he had made a difference, of having been in the right place at the right time to help, despite the dangers. The world didn't often grant opportunities like this, but when it did, it was up to him to seize them. He had done so, and in that moment, the old man knew he had fulfilled something deeper than just the need for survival. He had given a piece of himself to another life, and that made all the difference. A soft breeze swept through the trees, lifting the hem of his weathered coat and ruffling his hair. The scent of pine and earth filled the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the old man breathed deeply, letting the air fill his lungs and settle his soul. The tension in his shoulders eased, the knot in his chest slowly unraveling. As he looked down at the ground, his eyes found the faintest imprint of the bear cub's tiny paw, still visible in the damp earth. A symbol of survival, of the precious life he had saved. He knelt down slowly, placing his hand gently over the mark, feeling a strange sense of gratitude for the little creature, for the quiet bond that had formed between them, even if only for a moment. The cub's life had been a gift, and the old man had played a part in its continuation. That knowledge, that quiet truth, filled him with a contentment that he had not known in many years. It wasn't just the joy of saving the bear, but the joy of having helped, of having acted when it mattered most. The old man stood again, wiping the damp earth from his palms, and gave one last glance toward the fading path of the she-bear and her cub. His heart was light, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. There was no greater reward, no finer feeling than knowing that, despite all the risks and dangers of life, he had been able to do something truly good, something that mattered in a world that so often seemed indifferent. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the forest in a soft, golden glow, the old man turned and began his journey home, a quiet smile still playing at the corners of his lips, content in the knowledge that he had made the world just a little bit better, if only for one small bear. What do you think of the old man's encounter with the bear cub and the she-bear? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss new stories.